This list shows club committee calendar entries. These entries are, to a large extent, from the Club Leadership Handbook, which is shown here as CLH for Club Leadership Handbook. Some of them are from the District Leadership Handbook, which is shown as DLH, and many entries have been added, by me, just based on experience. I thought it would be useful to have those entries on a calendar here, and that's why I've added them, and you'll find if you find them useful. Let's take a little look through the columns here. Column A is simply a column with a numbering of line items to allow sorting in case we decide to sort this list in a different way. This can just always be useful to bring it back to its original order. I've already talked about the various sources: Club Leadership Handbook, District Leadership Handbook, and blank for it's coming from me. Then the type of event or activity. I really just like to break down here the four different groups, which are that there are activities to do with the club itself, activities that really affect directly the club members, and that's activities to do with the club community, club meetings, club member numbers, club member education, and here that's club member education and club member number. So anything that starts with club means we're talking here about activities that directly affect club members. Oh, and also club PR, of course, everything that starts with club. As a completely separate category in itself, we have the activities that are labeled with committee, which are the activities to do with the running of the club itself, such as elections, committee handover, producing a club success plan, etc. Then we have another category of activities in itself, that's contests. I have added a lot of entries here that have to do with contests because I think it's so important to plan them out well. And then here finally, activities purely to do with the way the club is connected to the district through area council meetings and district council meetings. Those are relevant for President and Vice President of Education, and area council meeting also for the Vice President of Membership. So we've got four groupings here. Anything to do with club, i.e. activities that directly affect the club members. Anything to do with the committee, i.e. to do with the running of the club. Anything to do with contests, and anything to do with district, i.e. the way the club is tied into the district. In terms of column E, event activity priority, well, I will admit I have assigned priorities here, and you may decide to assign your priorities differently. So I've called some of them key activity or key event, and why don't I just quickly show this. When I only show key activities and events, this list isn't really all that long. So one could consider the additional entries kind of as bonus entries that help with planning. And I guess what we should perhaps do as well here is put some important activities and events in there as well. So we've got a chunky list here, but those are really just the key ones. But then what we can add, if we wanted to, we can add here really bonus events, bonus activities, those that just depend on the club. And what I've added here as well is quite a few preparation steps. So when I've got an event and I want to plan for it, I've actually in some cases added a separate line item, which I just hope will be useful for planning. I also want to just highlight here what I felt would perhaps be quite useful is to show incentives separately. So all the incentives are listed, and you will see there are incentives for the way the committee runs the club, doing certain things correctly, like submitting the club officer list, attending club officer training. Then we've got, of course, a lot of incentives to do with the club member strength, with the number of club members, gaining and retaining members. And then we've got a whole smaller chunk, but significant chunk of incentives here to do with member education, which tend to all be kind of awarded at the end of the Toastmasters year, but really, of course, require activities throughout the Toastmasters year. So these are the well, I guess prioritization. I'm not saying that incentives have a different prioritization from those key or important events, but they are just separate. So I felt it's worthwhile allowing for us to be able to filter this list purely by incentives. All right, so now back to the full list. The list itself is column F, and I guess the more often we look at the list, the more familiar we will get with it, and the more obvious it will become what is what and why we need to do it. Then, and some of the, most of them are pretty much very, very strongly recommended to complete, and some of them, of course, are optional and for the committee itself to decide whether they want to actually include them into their year. Then we've got columns G to O for the actual club officer roles. We have the key 7 roles as stated in the club leadership handbook, and we have added column N, Vice President of Events, and column O, Vice President of Mentoring, because I think they're great roles. If they can be filled, it's very, very good for a club to have them filled. Now, finally, just looking here at columns Q to AD. May and June, club officer elections in May, and then this kind of prep and ramp up phase in June where we have lots of handovers and typically also already club officer training taking place, which also then of course takes place in July and August as well. And we can choose from the various events that are offered. Then the actual Toastmasters year proper, July to June. What we've tried to do is, through conditional formatting, just map out for you to be able to see very easily what happens when in the Toastmasters year. I'll quickly talk you through the 4 possible entries we've prepared for, but please feel free to change this around entirely if you decide to use this calendar and make your own entries and your own color coding for it. What we try to do is here very pale green with any kind of prep or planning tasks. So all that needs to be done is here to enter the letter P and you get that coloring. Then TBD means that we know something should be taking place in a certain period of time, here June or July, but we don't know which one yet, so I've just marked that as TBD. TBD means it's not taking place in both months typically. We don't need to do it in both months, it just takes place once, but we need to understand when exactly it will be. Conversely, where we have a time frame where we know that something should be sitting in a particular month, like the club officer elections in May, that's marked with an X. And then the darkest color here, just to make that pop out a little bit, are the deadlines. A D can be entered for deadline. And that's just really to show that most likely there'll be some sort of incentive when there's a deadline, or simply Toastmasters International telling us, well, you really want to complete this task by that date, please. All right, so this is really the approach for making this visual. There are these conditional formatting rules set up on the spreadsheet. Don't worry about it if you're not familiar with that. You can just use what's there if you decide to use this. P for planning, TBD for a time period where it still needs to be kind of found out or decided when exactly something takes place. X, where we're pretty confident that something will take place in a particular month. And D, well, we already know that there's a deadline associated with the activity or event.